Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the COVID Weekly. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Burchett, for October 6, 2020, powered by Averpoint.com. This week, we're going to debunk the conspiracy theory that COVID is caused by 5G. It's a good one. We want to start getting into conspiracy theories. Watch to the end of this video to see which one we will debunk next week. I genuinely think that these conspiracy theories are leading to behaviors that are killing Americans. This is serious stuff. This week is a great one. You can review all of our scientific evidence that argues against conspiracy theories on Averpoint.com. Check it out. And please, as always, give me feedback on these videos on social media. Now, so let's get into 5G causing COVID. This one is interesting. There's really two parts to it that are kind of wrapped together, okay? The first one, the first half of this conspiracy theory is that COVID is a hoax. It's not real. It's just so that the government keeps us at home and that they're able to build, and because we're at home, they're able to build more 5G cell towers, which are really made to spy on us for government surveillance. So this one relies that COVID is in fact a hoax. I'm going to deal with that in a second and show you, really answer a good scientific question, which is, how do we know that coronavirus is the, in fact, etiology, the cause for people that are getting sick with COVID? How do we know that? It's really interesting. Now, the second half of and that's going to debunk that. That's going to be the end of that one. The second half of this conspiracy gets into some stuff where there actually is a little science. And I'm going to talk about this later in the show too, which is, so the second conspiracy theory goes, people are getting sick and dying, but coronavirus isn't the reason. It's 5G. 5G, it's out here more than ever. That and cell phones are actually what's killing people, not an invisible virus that's going from person to person and is contagious. You can see how maybe that one is a little more plausible. We're going to get in order to answer that one, we're going to get into what is 5G, what kind of waves does it emit on the electromagnetic spectrum, and what science, is there any science to cell phone causing brain tumors? Are there any studies? We're going to review that. And you might be surprised to hear what I have to say about it, that at least you can understand where this conspiracy theory comes from. Okay, so let's get into it. So let's go back to the first one. 5G, COVID is a hoax. It's just a front so that the government can spy on us more and build more 5G cell towers everywhere and watch every bit of our life, right? Now, I have no doubt that the government and big business are interested in our behavior and our monitor and on their cell phones and all of this stuff. I don't disagree with any of that. However, for this conspiracy theory to work, coronavirus has to be a hoax. It's not. How do we know that coronavirus causes COVID? This is really interesting. I looked this stuff up and I learned something on this one. So first of all, when people were getting sick in the beginning in China, the first thing that we did was this thing called bronchoscopy. So people's lungs were getting infected. So you take a camera, you go in through the mouth, into the lungs, you spray some saline and some fluid around, and you suck out everything that comes with it. Sometimes you can do a biopsy where you take actually a piece of lung tissue and you examine that under the microscope, and you're able to get from these samples the virus. So you get the virus from somebody who's sick with COVID, and then you grow it on a certain kind of cell made for viral replication. These are called verocells. And you can observe after you do that viral replication, the virus destroying the cells. And so you know that you have the destructive pathogen, the destructive agent that's causing the disease. And then so once you get that, then you're going to do two things with it. One, sequence the genome. We know everything about the structure of COVID down to each amino acid that comprises this thing, and each piece of RNA. It's been completely sequenced tons of times already. So we've identified from these samples, we've identified it. And not only has this happened in China and Korea and the United States, this has happened and been replicated all over the world. Everybody's come to the same conclusion, which is coronavirus is the cause of COVID-19. Now, so you've got the virus genome, but what does it look like? You've seen these pictures in the media, of the kind of spherical thing, and it's got these spikes on it like that. Those are not artist renditions. Those are actually pictures taken from an electron microscope. So it looks like a microscope, but instead of just visible light, you look through it, you see visible light, an electron microscope goes much more detailed down to the size of an electron, and it produces that picture that you see. So that is actually what the coronavirus virus looks like if you could zoom into the level, into the atomic, the subatomic level, the size of an electron. That's how we know that coronavirus is the thing that's causing this disease. Now we have a test. I've seen this in front of my eyes where people have developed the same syndrome and they're COVID positive and they fit this definition that we've come to use that identifies this as coronavirus disease, COVID-19. So COVID, without a doubt, is caused by coronavirus. We know this for sure. That eliminates this hoax, this hoax part of the conspiracy theory that's a hoax. Now, when it comes down to it, like I said before, is there big business and government that wants to spy on you and get into your life and observe all these things? Absolutely. I don't doubt that at all. But we're now confronted with science, good science here, that that coronavirus is in fact real. And I think part of why this conspiracy theory still perpetuates, even despite really good science, it's a matter of hierarchy of beliefs, right? What do you believe more? Do you believe, again, like, not all of us are electron microscopists. Like, we don't sit in the lab and identify this stuff. So we don't have direct observation of it. Do you believe science and this kind of stuff from the media, like me, or do you believe more that the government's out to get us and spy on us, that kind of paranoid conspiracy belief? And I think the reason it perpetuates is that people have this belief, some that's deeper than science, that the government really is out to get us and spy on us, is kind of Orwellian. We're reading that in Book Club, 1984. If you're interested in Book Club, check it out, drlarry.com. People have a deeper belief. Did you like that plug? People have a deeper belief that the government is out to spy on you than science being real. And that's why that one persists. I completely reject that conspiracy theory. Again, I do think that there are interests that certainly want to literally spy on you and get all kinds of information, mainly to sell you stuff now, I think is the bigger worry. But COVID exists without a question. And it's fascinating, the science, like that we're able to sequence down to every single gene, every single amino acid and nucleotide in that thing, and see it at such level on electron microscopy. That's insane. That is just insane to me, even still now. So that's incredible. Okay, so let's get into the second half of this thing, which is, yeah, sure, there's a coronavirus, but that's not what's really making people sick and die. What's really making people sick and die is 5G and cell phones. We're using phones more and more, holding them to our heads. They're around us all the time. And now people are finally starting to die from it. Well, now 5G is this thing. We didn't have it before. That's really what's killing people. This one, there may be a little more beef to. It's still a conspiracy theory that we are going to debunk. Cat's out of the bag. But how? And explaining why this one works, I think, is interesting too, to have a little compassion for the conspiracy theory folks. What is 5G? What does that mean? Do you know what that means? I didn't know what the G meant. 5G is the 5th generation of the cell phone network, which includes all the towers and all of our phones. 5G. The first generation, let's just review a little history. This is good stuff. The first generation was in the 80s, and it delivered analog voice only. There was no checking your email and internet on this one. Second G in the 90s was digital voice. Third G in the 2000s started to get mobile data. So in the early 2000s, apps, we could do things. You could start to see stuff. Fourth G, mobile broadband. So 4G, and then 5G, again, higher technology in these cell towers that's ultimately going to enable not just us to watch TV from our phones, but then even to connect computers and do more and more. So it's the 5th generation. I'm not going to get into it more than that because it's not relevant to our purpose. But all of these, from 1st generation to 5th and your cell phone, they transmit data from the phone to a tower, sometimes a satellite. How do they do that? What goes in between? What radiates between the two of them? It's some form of energy, right? Let's take a step back and get into physics. It's a radio wave, okay? What is a radio wave? So here's the physics, and this gets into what is the electromagnetic spectrum, all right? So what do all these things have in common? I had to write this stuff down. Radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible light, UV, X-rays, and gamma rays. All of these are on what's called the electromagnetic spectrum. Excuse me. The electromagnetic spectrum is the physics kind of unifying idea that energy is transmitted from, it's how energy is transmitted from one place to another. And how does the energy move? It moves like a wave, like a radio wave. Wave has 2 components to it. It has the wavelength. So, this would be a longer wavelength as opposed to a shorter wavelength. How long the wave is, literally. And the frequency. The frequency is how often it repeats. So a longer wavelength typically isn't going to repeat as frequently. And a smaller wavelength is going to repeat more frequently. It's going to have a higher frequency. So visible light, for example, radio waves, whatever. It's like, what is light? How do we see things? How does light, it's thought to go, so like sunlight, for example, is thought to move like this, like a wave. And it emits energy from the sun, miles away, however million miles away, to Earth, like that. That's the electromagnetic spectrum. So where do cell phones fall on the electromagnetic spectrum? It's a radio wave. So the next question is, are radio waves thought to be safe? I'm going to get into that in a second. Typically, we've divided these waves up. Okay, so I didn't explain this. The longest wave of all of these guys is the radio wave. And then there's microwave, which is a little bit smaller. So radio waves is the longest one. Microwaves is a little less. Infrared, that's like a TV remote. Infrared goggles, right? We can't see infrared. We can see the visible light spectrum where the wavelength is a little bit smaller. Infrared, it's a little bit longer. We can't see it with our eyes, but we can put infrared goggles on and see it with that. It's kind of cool, right? It's like Predator. Remember the movie with the Predator? And he could change his vision so he could see a little more of the electromagnetic spectrum than we could, and it was an advantage, right? Technological advantage. We can't see radio waves. Our phone communicates with them, but they're not visible like that. So, we've got radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible, and then we get UV. And this is where things start to get distinguished. There's UVA, and then which ones are known to cause skin cancer? UVB from the sun. And right there is where we get the distinction between what's considered non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation. And ionizing radiation includes UVB, X-rays, like X-rays, CAT scans are more of a risk than X-rays, and gamma rays. So this is like nuclear bomb stuff, like Hiroshima, Chernobyl, which we absolutely know causes cancer. Awful, horrific, right? But those gamma rays are still a kind of ionizing radiation. What does ionizing mean? It means it can damage the cell, and more importantly, cancer-wise, it can cause mutation to your genes, mutation that makes cells more likely to replicate uncontrollably and cause cancer. That's ionizing radiation. UVB, X-rays, and gamma rays. So typically, all of this other stuff, visible spectrum, infrared, right? Light, it's not the sun, it's not the visible light from the sun that causes cancer. It's the UVB ray. Okay, it's a different kind, slightly different form of electromagnetic radiation. All of this other stuff, visible, infrared, microwave, and radio waves, are non-ionizing. In other words, your cell phone that uses radio waves have typically and conventionally never been thought to cause cancer. Are you afraid of using the radio or using the TV? Now you can see historically, if you look back in history, even when electricity came out, there was a natural human skepticism and fear of the unknown, right? We don't know what this is going to do. And you can say this about any new technology. We don't know what's going to happen in 100 years. Anything, you can take this with anything. Teslas haven't been around for 100 years. They've only been around for a few years, a decade. You don't know if a kid grows up in a Tesla when they're 90. You can use that line of reasoning for anything. And it's true to an extent, right? You can do every study now. You could maximize the Tesla exposure to rats in, developing rats in utero to see if it has anything, to see if it has any deleterious effect. But it's never going to be the same as a study where you follow somebody throughout their entire life, 90 or 100 years. We don't have that information on Teslas. We don't have that information on 5G. We don't have that information on cell phones. We really don't have a lot of evidence that shows, you don't have any evidence right now that shows that 5G towers and cell phone do cause problems. But you can see how you get stuck in this lack of the proving that it's safe. There's a lack of evidence that it's harmful, but there's also a lack of proof that it's safe. That's one of the seeds, one of the kernels, I think, where 5G people can still remain skeptical. And there's a small part of it where I'm like, okay, I'm okay with that. I think there is a certain logic to it. Now, we're going to go a step further. This is where it gets more interesting. There was a study, and it's totally one of these rat studies where they injected them with 10 million times the artificial sweetener than normal, and then they developed cancer. But let me just explain to you what it was, because this study, I think, is also one of the big seeds for the 5G cell phone controversy, okay? So this was a study, and again, check out the evidence at averpoint.com. We're going to link where this came from, but they took rats and they started to expose them 18 hours a day to 4 times the amount of cell phone stuff exposure that we would ever get close to them. This is radio waves. For 2 years, starting from when they were just days developing, okay? For this study, rats' whole bodies, radiation from mobile phones for 2 years. There was no cancer leak found for the female rats or mice, but it did demonstrate tumors in the male rats. Now, interestingly, these male rats lived longer than the control rats that didn't have that exposure, but they did develop a tumor. So what does that mean? That much exposure, again, to rats in utero, it's hard to know what that means with our cell phone usage. So that's where people said, well, don't put it next to your face. Use earbuds. Use things that keep it away. And what's thought, there is evidence, what is thought to be risk of radio waves is the thermal effect, or if there's any heat being emitted, where it's not like, it's not ionizing. We know that. It's not going to mutate your DNA. You don't have to worry about that. But if it does, there is a possibility that proximity may lead to a thermal effect of damage. So just keep it away, right? Now, so there's 2 seeds where you can see, okay, maybe, especially if you distrust media, government, whatever, that might make you believe that. Let me get into one more thing that kind of explains why this thing is a conspiracy. And this comes from, I got my references here. But this one is from the American Cancer Society, okay? And I want to read you, I found this to be really interesting, but regarding, so the American Cancer Society often comes out and they'll put official statements where it's like, we know that processed red meat causes cancer. We know cigarette smoking causes cancer. Alcohol causes cancer. And then the World Health Organization has an international agency for research on cancer. And they'll say, yes, we know these to be carcinogen. We know these to be cancer causing in various levels. American Cancer Society regarding cell phone use and 5G towers, they have no official statement. So they've looked at all of this data and they've refused to come out and say, no, it doesn't cause it. Yes, it does. They've avoided the issue, which is kind of interesting. Now, the World Health Organization, on the other hand, has classified radio frequency radiation as possibly cancer-causing, carcinogen, possibly carcinogenic to humans, based on this rat study. So what that really means is there was one animal study that suggested maybe. And the lack of better data to stomp that out and say no, and I think the better data is this stuff where it's like, yeah, we've followed kids from 0 to 100. We totally know that it doesn't cause that. They're not willing to say that. Now there's other, but hang on. So you can see why it's like, oh, well, maybe this isn't, maybe keep your cell phone away from your head. That's it. I think that's all I can word. U.S. Food and Drug Administration, based on the studies described in detail, there's insufficient evidence to support a causal association between radio frequency radiation exposure and tumor formation. So the FDA, the US FDA, said, look, we looked at all this stuff. We don't think that's good enough, that there's really a causal link that radio frequency causes cancer right now. Yeah, we looked at the rat study, whatever. World Health Organization has a different criteria, but FDA says, no, we don't think so. National Toxicology Program, this is another cancer-causing, this is another kind of database of cancer-causing agents. They did not list it in theirs. Again, basically that rat study not being good enough to convince them that this is a cancer-causing agent. FCC, same thing. Now, the CDC, here's what the CDC says. At this time, we don't have the science to link health problems to cell phone use. Scientific studies are underway to determine whether cell phone use may cause health effects. So, similarly, we're not impressed that this is good enough evidence to make this statement. We think there should be more studies, and that's where we're at. The point of all of that is, at this point, there's that little study. It's a very difficult thing to study. Our cell phone use changes, right? Like we're using these phones more and in different ways. It's kind of a moving target. This is a difficult thing to study. There is a little uncertainty around this, as there is for a lot of things, like Tesla's causing cancer. You can't prove to me that that isn't the case. You can say, well, there's no evidence, and that's probably the most true thing that you can say that refutes a conspiracy theory that Tesla's cause tumors or cancers, or that Tesla's cause COVID. Probably couldn't do the Tesla cause COVID one, but that's a much easier study to do. But anyway, my point being, I can understand why the conspiracy theory that 5G makes people sick can linger, because it's something that scientifically is difficult to disprove. That's my whole point. Now, it's another jump to take that and say, well, all the people you see here are sick, not with COVID, but because of 5G. That's an easier study to do, where you can just compare people with sick, how much they use their phone. But the problem is, just about everybody who's got COVID uses their phone. But I imagine in some parts of the third world, there are going to be people who have gotten COVID that have no cell phone use. Well, then you can blame it on the tower. Well, then you could probably demonstrate people out in rural Africa where there's no 5G, there's no tower, that do get and die of COVID. I think that part of the conspiracy theory is nonsense and doesn't even need a more scientific explanation. But But again, this 5G thing, my guess is that you will see this rear its head and pop up over and over and over as a conspiracy theory, and you can see why it exists. There you go. So this is an interesting one. I really liked doing this research. I learned about 5G. I learned about the exact way that we kind of came up with electron microscopy and how we demonstrated the genome of COVID. I think that's really interesting. What are we going to, so you can review all of this stuff on averpoint.com, all of the data on averpoint.com. Check that out. We'll list all of these sources and these studies, including that cell phone rat study, the American Cancer Society links. Next week, what's it going to be next week? That COVID, we're gonna evaluate with the science about that COVID was created in a lab in Wuhan, China. I found, before we started doing this research, I found that one to be quite possible. So what does the research say arguing the other way against that? That's what we're going to do for you next time. So be sure to tune in. Please give me some feedback on this. You can reach out to me on Dr. Larry Burchett on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and the like. Again, averpoint.com. Check it out there. Thanks for watching. As always, take care of yourself. Stay safe. Stay sane. Do your part. We'll see you next time.